It's strange to think that, in one form or another, Marvel fans have been discussing Spider-Man 4 since 2007. There's not just the cancelled follow-up to the much-maligned third entry in Sam Raimi's trilogy, which, for the record, is not as bad as has been made, but also the upcoming confirmed sequel to 2021's Spider-Man No Way Home. Rumours regarding the latter have expectedly picked up over the last few months, with speculation pointing towards a 2025 release. But so too, strangely, have discussions surrounding the former. Hello everyone, what is up? It is me, Ewan for What Culture, and I want to talk to you today about a little old movie called Spider-Man 4 and why, in my opinion, it feels closer than ever to maybe potentially happening. Maybe. Raimi's fourth Spider-Man film, a project that was abandoned some 14 years ago, is still garnering attention today, with both the director and Mary Jane Watson actress Kirsten Dunst respectively being questioned on the prospects of it somehow happening over the last couple of months. The responses from each party were both honest, and for those Raimi fans still hopeful of a belated fourth Spider-Man film, potentially even a bit encouraging. Speaking to CBR, Raimi said that while he isn't involved in any current discussions regarding Spider-Man 4, he is aware of the rumours and that he would be the first to know if such a project was put in motion. It is also worth noting that Raimi had previously stated in a 2022 interview with Comic Book that, quote, all things are possible, and how he'd love to work with Tobey Maguire again. Dunst was equally candid when quizzed on the matter by IndieWire, saying of a potential Spider-Man 4, quote, I don't think we need that, which, totally fair. At the same time though, the Civil War star did say that she would have accepted a role in No Way Home had it been offered, and just the other month admitted in an interview with Marie Claire that she'd happily do another superhero movie, quote, because you get paid a lot of money, and I have 2 children, and I support my mother. And honestly, that's the most hell yeah inducing response of the bunch. While it's easy to chalk up chatter of Raimi somehow reviving his lost Spider-Man movie as pie-in-the-sky fanboy musings, even with Raimi and Dunst leaving the door slightly ajar for such a thing to happen, it may not be as ludicrous a sounding prospect as it would have seemed a few years ago. Maguire's return was a key draw behind Spider-Man No Way Home, as were fellow returning castmates Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe as Dr. Octopus and Green Goblin respectively. Factor in a willingness from competitor DC to have multiple incarnations of Batman on the big screen at once, as well as Sony's enthusiasm to milk the Spider-Man license for all it's worth, with tawdry adaptations like Morbius and Madam Web, plus overall nostalgic trends in recent releases, and suddenly the idea of Spider-Man 4 getting made doesn't seem all that silly after all. This will either inspire eye rolls or fist pumps depending on your mileage of superhero glut, and to confess, I'm not even sure how I feel about the prospect of it happening either. What I do know is that I love that incarnation of the character, as well as Raimi's films more generally, and with the right concept in mind, it could be a killer. Should it happen? Well, maybe not, but in the event its prospects are genuine, then there's every chance that Spider-Man 4 could be worthwhile, adventurous, and better than some of the nostalgic trends that have resulted in films like No Way Home and The Flash. One of the big reasons why Spider-Man 4 is still capturing attention is that, at one point, it seemed like an inevitability. Despite garnering less critical praise than the preceding 2 efforts, Spider-Man 3 was still a huge box office success, ending its theatrical run as the highest grossing entry of Raimi's trilogy. Plans for a sequel were quickly publicized, with Sony marking in a May 2011 premiere, and Raimi, Maguire, and Dunst all confirming their involvement. John Malkovich was eyed for the part of the Vulture, in this interpretation a ruthless military contractor, and Anne Hathaway for Felicia Hardy, aka Black Cat. Maybe the best part of it all though was that Bruce Campbell was also set to benefit from a slightly larger role as Quentin Beck, better known by his villainous moniker of Mysterio. But, as we all know, Spider-Man 4 was shelved 3 years after its announcement due to a mixture of contributing factors. Raimi himself was reportedly displeased with Spider-Man 3, and also struggled with the script for the Vulture-focused follow-up. With Sony adamant that a 2011 release date had to be met, and pre-production stalling, Raimi excised himself from the project completely, with the studio then announcing that the franchise would be rebooted. Yay! The Amazing Spider-Man, starring Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker, was released in 2012, a year later than the do-or-die 2011 deadline Sony had placed on Raimi, with Spider-Man 4 then well and truly buried under a big ol' pile of Sandman sand. Not that the sequel's cancellation stopped conversations surrounding it though. The fact that The Amazing Spider-Man released in such close proximity to the Raimi films provoked a sense of confusion. Spider-Man 3 was only 5 years old when the Garfield-Emma Stone-led reboot premiered, and it also retrod familiar ground as an origin story. What was the point of doing away with the Raimi interpretation if the results were so familiar and were still so sourceless? This sentiment has been exacerbated in retrospect by the fact that the Garfield incarnation received only 2 dedicated outings of middling quality, sandwiched between Raimi's peerless originals and a juggernaut franchise in the MCU. There will be those out there who feel that the Mark Webb films are valid and worth celebrating, evidently so given their representation in No Way Home, but they'll always be the movies that came in place of Spider-Man 4, a sequel to a beloved and popular incarnation of the character. Regardless of how that film would have turned out in its original concept, in a straight shootout between The Amazing Spider-Man and another wall-crawler film from Raimi, we have ourselves a perfect nuclear bomb versus coughing baby scenario. There's just no way that The Amazing Spider-Man could ever compete. And, not to provoke the ire of the comments section too prematurely, the same could arguably be said of the John Watts film starring Tom Holland, which failed to compete with Raimi's incarnation on both a technical and thematic level by sidestepping Peter Parker's working-class origins and spotlighting digital sludge. Heck, No Way Home itself was a huge phenomenon precisely because it hinged on characters and motifs from Raimi's trilogy. My point here is that despite that interpretation coming to a close in 2007, its shadow has loomed large over Spider-Man specifically, and comic book cinema more generally, ever since. But regardless of the prospects of Spider-Man 4 one day happening, or why we're still here talking about it, I honestly believe there is more creative impetus for it to happen than there is for another outing from Holland, or a franchise reboot, or obviously another weird Sony spin-off. Unless it's one about Big Wheel. You gotta love Big Wheel. By far, one of the most frustrating aspects of mainstream comic book Spider-Man coming up to about 20 to 30 years now is that the character has stagnated. If you read Spider-Man from his debut in Amazing Fantasy under Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, all the way through to the Clone Saga shenanigans of the 1990s, then you got to spend time with a version of Peter Parker who aged and progressed. Pete left high school, married Mary Jane, and witnessed the deaths of both his first love and his closest friend. Hell, even Sandman got to embark on an arc of his own, evolving from a supervillain to an anti-hero and then even an Avenger. Sandman is secretly the coolest Spider-Man character, just saying. It's hard to believe now, but when Norman Osborn died in the concluding chapter of The Night Gwen Stacy Died in 1973, he stayed that way for 20 years. This was retconned during the infamous Clone Saga, which we can probably blame for all the woes that have afflicted Peter Parker in the decades since. Norman's resurrection exemplified what was to follow, as Marvel grew anxious that an older and married Peter Parker wasn't relatable to its young, predominantly male readership base. So he was temporarily retired, with clone Ben Reilly stepping in as a youthful bachelor. Pete would return, but this incarnation of the character was essentially doomed, as anxieties regarding his relatability persisted into the 2000s and culminated in explosive fashion with the storylines One More Day and Brand New Day, which, hoo boy, are both very stinky. For those somehow blessed enough to have not read these comics, here's a brief explainer. These editorially enforced storylines had Peter wipe his marriage with Mary Jane from existence to save the life of an elderly Aunt May in a bargain with Mephisto, and they remain the most consequential and controversial comics of Marvel's modern era. For the most part, since One More Day released, Peter has been stuck in the same familiar space, as a young adult juggling the same old responsibilities. It's bland, it's safe, and it's meant to be both of those things. If Marvel can keep Peter Parker in his most recognizable guise, then that should, in theory, please everyone. Only, we know that isn't the case. Look at the most successful Spider-Man stories of the last decade, and you'll see they all have the same thing in common. Spotlight versions of the character who age and progress through time. This was the case with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Insomniac's PlayStation games, and more recently, the rebooted Ultimate Spider-Man comics from writer Jonathan Hickman and artist Marco Checchetto. Interpretations of real consequence that have the freedom to take the character of Peter Parker and make him actually grow up. Hickman and Checchetto's Ultimate Spider-Man comics are especially pertinent to the discussion of a future Raimi movie, because they spotlight the character in a similar age and context to what would feasibly be the case with a sequel. Peter here is a husband to MJ and has 2 young children. The difference this time is that he's only just started his career as Spider-Man in his late 30s, which brings with it new and unique challenges. Now, obviously, this isn't a one-to-one fit for a potential Raimi sequel, but it does reiterate the appeal of seeing an older Spider-Man navigating different responsibilities. We caught glimpses of that with Maguire's return in No Way Home, but under Raimi's direction, it's a sort of premise that could really flourish on the big screen. The last big thing I want to caveat with all this discussion is that I think that the overall bent towards nostalgia we've seen in movies over the last 5 to 10 years is really boring. I'm on the record as a No Way Home hater, and abducting Michael Keaton's Batman for The Flash was borderline criminal. I'd much rather see something new and original than to dip back into the well of an IP that has gone way past the point of saturation. However, legacy sequels can and indeed have yielded tremendous results in the past, with Ryan Coogler's Creed the standout example. Even if the impulses that lead to nostalgic filmmaking are largely cynical, with the right people involved, valid and affecting cinema can still be created. This is essentially my way of saying that, even if it was made for the wrong reasons, a legacy Spider-Man sequel headed up by Raimi that picked up with Peter and MJ as middle-aged adults could be worthwhile. More recent Spidey stories have shown a willingness and enthusiasm from creators and audiences to engage with aged incarnations of the character. And while Raimi was smothered by the machinery of the MCU with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, all the flourishes that were there tell us that he can still create compelling comic book cinema that is also uniquely him. It's why we fell in love with those movies to begin with. Now, to me, that is way more worthwhile than another MCU film, or even the vast majority of announced comic book movies on the way for that matter. Conceptually, it may seem trite, but there's more that Raimi could accomplish with this interpretation of the character than any of the other live-action Spider-Mans we've gotten within the last decade have actually managed to do. Does Spider-Man 4 need to happen? No, absolutely not. Kirsten Dunst is more than right on that front. Raimi's films are 20 years old and have left an indelible imprint on the character and genre. But if it were to come together somehow, and the odds are better than they once were, then it could be so much more than just another nostalgic legacy sequel. But I want to know your thoughts on Spider-Man 4 in the comments below. Do you think it could actually happen? And better yet, would you even want it? Once you've done that, if you could flip on over to the like button and subscribe, that would be properly lovely. Otherwise, thank you all for watching, and I'll hopefully whip you next time. Bye!